Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about maritime history, especially in California, and the new Art of Navigation exhibit at the Maritime Museum of San Diego, with my guest, Dr. Raymond Ashley. He is president and CEO of the Maritime Museum of San Diego. He has taught courses in history and archaeology at the University of California, San Diego, and at University of San Diego. He teaches history of navigation and has published papers in American Neptune and a number of other professional journals. He has sailed tens of thousands of miles, built, restored, renovated, and preserved ships, and is a licensed captain for sail, steam, and auxiliary vessels of 200 tons registry. And he is very active as a relief captain for many vessels, including the museum's active fleet, including the State Tall Ship Californian, the Steam Yacht Medea, the Swift Boat PCF 816 Pilot, and most recently the Galleon San Salvador. He is a member of many civic and professional organizations and serves on the boards of the Tall Ships America, the California Missions Foundation, the Maritime Alliance Foundation, the San Diego Port Tenants Association, the Heritage Committee of the International Congress of Maritime Museums, and the President's Advisory Council of Mystic Seaport. He was recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award by both the Maritime Alliance in San Diego and the International Maritime Heritage Alliance. And he has been knighted with the rank of Knight Commodore, Order of Isabella La Catholica, by direction of His Majesty King Felipe VI of Spain. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for that kind introduction, and it's nice to be here talking with you.
There are so many different issues I want to talk about because you are totally involved with ships and navigation, and in researching for this program, I discovered that instruments were at first perceived as expressions of esoteric art rather than science. How did that come about that we finally accepted instruments, that navigators going around the world finally adopted the compass, which was measuring a quality of nature, magnetism, that humans were not even able to sense?
Right. You've nailed it really well. Today we think science couldn't exist without instruments and without mathematics, right? They're everywhere, and they're associated with scientific investigation, experiments, and so forth. But that wasn't always true. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote that instruments tend to distort the human senses, and that really that investigation of natural phenomenon is best done without any intermediary interventions like instruments. So that whole notion that in science you can't have science without instruments is fairly recent, and in fact it's one of the hallmarks of the beginning of the early modern era. Really, there were very few areas of human effort in which mathematics and instruments played an important role. Military engineering was one, mining was one, and ultimately navigation was one. But those became so dependent upon instruments and math that the practice of using them then migrated into a whole bunch of other things that people did. And now you can't imagine getting through the day without using instruments and math and that sort of thing.
We've talked about the importance of instruments, and now, of course, all shipping depends on using modern science. Do they have all the instruments needed to navigate properly, or does somebody need to make a new instrument?
There's always new things coming out, and it's not like it was 100 years ago where you had to use a sextant to make a celestial observation, measuring the angle between the sun or the star or a planet or the moon and the horizon, and then work that out mathematically. Now you just push a button on a GPS and bang, it tells you what your latitude, longitude is and has a chart on the screen and has your ship on it, so it's pretty automatic. So yeah, there's all kinds of electronic navigation aids now that would have been something totally undreamed of 100 years ago.
Before instruments, people did sail the oceans, and the Polynesians were very famous for traveling the oceans, looking at the sky and using the environment as as points of reference. And of course, a lot of ships stayed near the coastline, I suppose, in order for them to see that they weren't going to fall off the edge of the earth?
Yeah, that's true. And people have been sailing across oceans for thousands of years, and sometimes without instruments. And in fact, people still do. Piloting is a sort of a portion of navigation where you've got visual contact with everything when you're coming into a port or something like that. You're looking at buoys, you're looking at other ships, and you're looking at the land on either side of the channel, and it's pretty much like driving your car. When you do that, you're using a system of wayfinding called relative reference. It's as though on your ship or in your car, you're at the center of the universe, and everything is moving by you, right? And that's the way people thought of the space they moved within for thousands of years and the way we still do it. So if you look at the GPS on your car, it's not always a map. You're looking at a little car moving across the screen. Sometimes you're looking at a road, and that's a relative reference system. Well, when you're using a map and you're visualizing the space you're moving through as though you were looking down on it from above, that's an absolute reference system, and that is what you need instruments for. So you mentioned the compass. It really was the first instrument that measured a quality of nature humans couldn't sense. When the Chinese invented it, they used it mostly for orienting buildings and things, feng shui kinds of things, and it went from there to Arabs who used it to navigate, wayfind across deserts, but they didn't use it in ships. Neither the Chinese nor the Arab seafarers used them. But when Europeans got their hand on the compass, about the year 1250, 1260 or so, when it started to become a fairly common instrument, immediately it changed the way that people perceive space. So the first modern rational representation of space, the first modern map we have of any kind, is a map called the Carta Pisana of about 1270. And so it's no coincidence that that map came out just a few years after the introduction of the compass on board ships, European ships that were using it for wayfinding, because the compass abstracts space, and so does the map. And so when you use a map, you're using a model of the space you're moving within. And at that time, no one had ever been up in an airplane. No one had ever seen space depicted that way. And yet you have this tool that allows you to go from one place to another out of sight of land. So it really was a pretty amazing waypoint in history when people started using these things.
You mentioned maps. When we look at older maps, it's amazing because they consider them art. The instruments, reference texts, nautical charts, which were tools and products, were also considered objects of exquisite beauty. And so there would be all sorts of beautiful, detailed landscapes and pictures of people, explorers, and renderings of gorgeous ships. And the ships were designed to be beautiful as well, not just to be practical. I assume in your new exhibit at your museum, you show some very lovely pieces.
Yeah, we do. We're really lucky. We were able to borrow really beautiful antique maps from the Barry Ruddiman collection. We were able to borrow first edition books. These are the printing press came out, and people were able to actually own a book that described the experiences and adventures of people sailing to distant exotic places. That was a pretty new thing in the 17th century and the early 18th century. And we have some first editions of those voyage accounts also, as well as model ships, and we have paintings. But what you're talking about, the maps themselves, when we look at maps today, they're pretty rational constructs. You know, they just have the information on them. But centuries ago, they were always highly embellished with cartouches that were very baroque. The map maker's name was there, and the map was there, and the country of origin was there. And there were also lots of embellishments in the spaces themselves, exotic people and the kind of houses they had, plants, the ships that different kinds of people would use in different places. And, of course, there were sea monsters that were strewn about the oceans, and a lot of them. A lot of those embellishments actually conveyed information. So, for instance, you're looking at a little picture of a ship in a chart, and you think that it's a decoration, but actually that ship being shown in the chart sailing along is giving you an indication of the likely wind direction you're going to find if you're sailing in that space. So a lot of those embellishments actually served dual purposes. They made the object beautiful, but they also conveyed more information.
In addition to those kinds of objects, your museum also exhibits ships. You're south of Balboa Park, which has some famous museums, because you've got to be on the water. And therefore, you have created a majestic, full-scale operational version of the galleon San Salvador, the man of war HMS Surprise, the schooner Californian, and your museum flagship, Star of India, which was a veteran of over 21 navigations around the Earth. I guess since your museum is about 100 years old, you have acquired quite a number of ships.
Yeah, 9 or 10 of them actually, and you've named quite a few. That's a pretty cool element of this exhibit, because normally you go to a museum and you would see things presented like works of art, or in our case, antique maps, antique instruments, and so forth, and you marvel and wonder at those. On the maps and in the paintings, there's these ships. Well, sitting right there where you can visit them are actual full-scale versions of the very things being depicted on those maps and paintings and so forth. It's a really unique opportunity to experience a topic like this on all these different levels.
Tell me more about the Star of India.
The Star of India is the oldest active ship in existence. We take her sailing every few years, and our most recent sail was last November, where we had the Star of India out sailing with our galleon, the San Salvador, with the Californian. And you mentioned the Polynesian seafarers. We were also at the time being visited by the legendary Hawaiian voyage canoe Hokulea. So there's all of this sort of heritage of seafaring being presented out on the ocean when we were sailing the Star of India. She's also significant in another way. There's only 4 ships in existence that carried human beings across the oceans during the age of sail. There's only 4 of them left of all the thousands of ships that did that generated the massive migration of humanity across the world's oceans. Of the other 3, though, none of them are active. One is in a dry dock, in a permanent dry dock in Bristol. Another one is in Australia, hauled out of the water. Another one is really just the ruins of a ship in Australia. And then the other one is the Star of India. So the Star of India is the last ship sailing that once carried immigrants across oceans in the age of sail. Everybody, no matter who you are on the earth today, is a descendant of somebody who crossed an ocean during the age of sail. So that element is essential, is one of the things that makes all humans, binds us all together, and the Star of India is the last ship that you can go on that actually participated in that enterprise. It's a pretty significant thing, really.
But you also constructed the galleon San Salvador. What's involved in doing that?
Yeah, you mentioned maritime history in California's maritime history, and of course there have been people living in California for thousands of years, and they probably came across the North Pacific thousands of years ago in a maritime event, which archaeologists call the following the Kelp Highway. So all the Native Americans are probably descended from seafarers as well. But when Europeans first arrived on the West Coast, it was in 1542 under the command of a Spanish explorer named Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. It was a Spanish expedition, and they were attempting to find a way to China. Prior to Cabrillo's expedition, 4 separate Spanish expeditions ended up having to circumnavigate the world without wanting to, because they just couldn't figure out a way how to get back across the Pacific. And unless that was determined, you really couldn't have worldwide trade. You really couldn't have connections between the Americas and China very easily unless you could get back across the Pacific. So that's what he was trying to do. And in the course of that, sailed along the California coast, and it was the first time that Europeans had encounters with the indigenous peoples that had been living here for thousands of years. It's kind of that connection or that meeting of these 2 different peoples from different places that had no prior knowledge of one another. That's kind of a genesis of an origin story. And because of that, there have been depictions of Cabrillo's flagship, the San Salvador, everywhere in California, and Cabrillo's name itself is on 1.2 million places in California. It's the most common place name by far in California, and one of the most common place names in the United States. So by building the ship, it was an effort to really start telling the story from that point and create something that people could step into, like a time machine, step into the past, and get a sense of what it might have been like almost 500 years ago to sail along the coastline of California. Now you ask what it was like. It wasn't an easy thing to build because people did not build ships to plans in those days. Shipwrights built what was in their head. And in consequence, we had to rely upon artwork. Period artists like Peter Bruegel the Elder that drew hundreds of images of ships of that period, rely upon underwater archaeology of some of the few shipwrecks where there's been elements survived, contracts between shipbuilders and people that were paying to have ships built for them, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of fragmentary evidence. And we had to combine all of that and use that to generate a set of plans for a ship that would not only reflect the period, but something you could actually go sailing on. I mean, we could take the public sailing on, so it had to pass Coast Guard requirements as well. So there were a lot of things, complexities involved with it that Cabrillo himself 500 years ago didn't face when he was building the original version of that ship. So it was a big project for us.
The galleon San Salvador, creating a seaworthy replica of California's Ship of Origin story project, was awarded the Governor's Historic Preservation Award in 2017. 17 because it is a fascinating story, and you have so many more stories of maritime history that we're going to explore when we return in a moment with Dr. Raymond Ashley, president of the Maritime Museum of San Diego.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. Raymond Ashley, President and CEO of the Maritime Museum of San Diego. You obviously love the sea. You have traveled thousands of miles on the sea. Could you tell me the difference in being a licensed captain for sail versus steam versus other kinds of ships?
They're all different. There's 5 centuries of ships being represented in a museum. We have a submarine, for instance. I wouldn't begin to know how to make a submarine work. I don't drive all of them. But essentially, to be able to conduct any kind of commercial enterprise with a ship, you've got to have a license, just like a pilot has to have a license. Consequently, the Coast Guard issues licenses to captain, and they're specific about the size of ship you're allowed to operate and the kind of ships.
You have traveled thousands of miles on the seas, the oceans. What was one of your most frightening experiences, or what was one of your most interesting and unusual experiences?
I sailed to Hawaii with my daughter, just the two of us, as a father-daughter project. Frightening. I've been in 3 hurricanes, and I thought they were pretty frightening.
Where do you plan to sail next?
I'm going to retire in a few months, and I hope to go sailing. There's an island off the coast of Costa Rica called Cocos Island. Over the centuries, many ships have stopped there. It's uninhabited. It was the island that placed a fictional story for Jurassic Park in. Over the centuries, ships have stopped there and carved the names of the ships into rock and a cliff wall. And so my goal is to go there and take rubbings of those names and then write the stories of 12 or 15 of the ships that passed through there. So I'll sail down the coast of Mexico and Central America out to Cocos Island, and then probably sail to Marquesas, and then Hawaii, and then Pacific Northwest and home. So do this kind of circuit of the Pacific.
You have taught courses in history and archaeology. You have a degree in anthropology. You have a degree in maritime history and museum studies. There are many old shipwrecks being found under the sea. Is there any one shipwreck that is more significant than another?
Well, the most famous one is the Titanic, I think, because it was one of the most famous disasters of all time. And so that's got a lot of notoriety. Never mind, there's a film which won lots of Academy Awards. Multiple films made about it. In terms of the most restored, though, that you're talking about a shipwreck that was been brought back from the bottom of the ocean and recovered. The 2 most famous ones are the Vasa, Swedish man of war, that sunk on its main voyage, only 20 minutes into its main voyage in Stockholm Harbor in 1628, I believe. And she was rediscovered in the 1950s and brought up and then preserved, and you can see her today, one of the most popular cultural attractions in Europe. And the Mary Rose, which is a Tudor warship from the time of King Henry VIII that was discovered back in the 70s, brought up, and she is in a climate-controlled environment in Portsmouth Naval Dockyard in England, and you can visit that one too. So those are 2 famous ships that have been brought up from the bottom of the ocean, conserved, not restored, but conserved in their present form, and you're able to look at them and just be amazed by it. I mean, both of them are just amazing.
You have been involved in reconstruction of ships and also restoration of ships. Which is harder?
They're different, but sometimes, depending on how far gone an old ship is when you start to restore it, but it can be actually a lot more work to rebuild an old ship than to just build a new one from scratch.
You have collaborated on a range of film and video with the Maritime Museum of San Diego and the Park and Recreation Department projects, including History of Oceanic Exploration, Voyages of the San Salvador, Cabrillo's Journey, Galleon San Salvador, in coordination with the Cabrillo National Monument, First Contact, The Voyage of Cabrillo, and The Man Who Saved the World. The latter one I find most interesting because I didn't realize that it had a maritime history. Wasn't that about a Russian who didn't want to recognize that the signal for a nuclear attack was really false?
Yeah, well, we don't anymore, but we used to have a Cold War era Russian submarine, a Foxtrot class submarine at our museum. We didn't keep that one. But when it was here, we had this exhibit, and that's what we developed that exhibit around, is that story. And it wasn't our particular submarine, but it was a sister ship put to it. There were actually 4 of them that were ordered by the Soviet Union to break the blockade around Cuba that had been imposed during Kennedy's administration as a result of the discovery that the Soviets had put missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads in Cuba. So it was a really tense moment. It was one of the most tense moments of the last living memory, and we got pretty close to actually there being a war. When these 4 submarines were ordered to break through the blockade, 3 of them were discovered by U.S. ships and told to come to the surface and escort out of the area, but this one submarine got pretty far into the area that they weren't supposed to be, and the American ships were dropping these small explosive charges. Not as big as a depth charge, it couldn't sink it, but that makes a big noise. Well, to the guys in the submarine, though, they didn't know whether they were being depth charged for real or not, and they were out of radio contact with their home base. What few radio reports they had suggested to them that a war had already broken out. Well, what the U.S. Navy didn't know is that each of those submarines had a nuclear torpedo on it. And in this particular instance, they were underwater long enough that there wasn't much oxygen left. The CO2 level was high. The temperature inside the submarine was over 100 degrees. They were under an enormous amount of stress, and they had a firing solution on a nearby American aircraft carrier. And the captain of the ship wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo at the aircraft carrier, and that could have started a world war. He was talked out of it by the squadron commander, who really didn't have authority over him, but was very persuasive. That guy persuaded the captain of the sub to surface and make sure that indeed they were correct, that war had broken out. They knew there was a danger to them if they'd done that, but he said, we could still fire the weapon anyway. So they came to the surface. The Americans steamed right up and said, "Are you guys okay? Is there anything you want? Is there anything we can give you?" And narrowly averted a war breaking out. So it was a pretty critical moment in recent world history. When we had this submarine, you could actually relive what it would have been like to be 600 or 700 feet deep, being depth charged, and wondering whether the world was coming to an end or not. It was an opportunity to take a ship and tell a story with it, and that's what we specialize in.
You have so many stories and many permanent exhibits. How does one find you? What is your website? And what are some of the other stories that one might find out more about by visiting your place?
You can find our website really just by typing in Maritime Museum of San Diego, but it's sdmaritime.org. On our website, it's got all our ships and their history and lots of information. You can even download a paper model of the San Salvador if you want and print it out on your printer. There's videos and films and things like that on our website. Physically, we are located at a really prominent location right on the bay, directly across the street from the county administration building. So the Star of India, our flagship, is probably one of the most iconic things in San Diego, so it's pretty easy to find. And if we've got sails set like we do at the moment at the dock, then it's even easier to find. And so far as the ships go, each one of them has their own story, and each one of them comes from a different place, a different period. So it's the closest thing you're ever going to find to being able to step into a time machine and going back to all these different times and places.
We've talked about navigation. We've talked about your ships. What are some of the other exhibits?
That's a good one. We interpret things like the history of the Navy in San Diego, the history of trade, commercial fishing, yachting, and the age of sail and the age of steam. You can actually go out on our ships. One of our vessels, the Pilot from 1914, goes out 7 days a week. Another one, we have a Vietnam era swift boat that goes out several times a day on weekends, and the docents on that vessel are usually guys that fought on those boats in Vietnam, and they can tell people what it was like to do that. We also have the state tall ship Californian that goes out on Sundays usually, and you can actually help sail the ship, participate with that. And then the San Salvador goes out typically on Saturdays, and it's the only age of exploration ship in the United States that people can actually go sailing on. And like the Californian, you can help sail the ship as well. There's all kinds of opportunities from actual on-the-water adventures to exhibits, films, and things of that nature.
An exciting place to visit. What is your next project for the museum?
Actually, we've restored and built ships for several years, so we're now partway through a really long project that's going to take several years to actually reposition the ships from their present locations in the bay at the Embarcadero, a little bit further out into the bay, and the construction of a museum building. Most museums have buildings, and most people think a museum is a building, or it has to be in a building. We're unusual in that respect because we don't have a building. Everything is the ships. So this is something we think that will make it more obvious that there's an institutional presence at our location, and we think it will increase attendance and make it much more clear and obvious to everyone that there's a museum here rather than the image of a bunch of old ships tied up at the Embarcadero.
You were knighted with the rank of Knight Commander, Order of Isabella la Catholica, Malaga by the direction of His Majesty King Felipe VI of Spain. Why did Spain honor you?
It was actually, there were two of us, the naval architect, Doug Sharp, who designed the San Salvador and oversaw a good portion of the construction of it, was also knighted by the King of Spain, and then myself also because of the role in creating the ship and raising the money and doing a lot of history and stuff. It was a way that Spain has this order where they knight non-Spanish citizens for service to Spain and for highlighting Spanish history. So it was just a way of acknowledging Spain's own history, I think, and an expression of gratitude for our willingness to do that and to tell their story while we're telling ours also.
You are on the board of the President's Advisory Council of Mystic Seaport. That's a strange name. What does that do?
Well, I was. The former president had an advisory council of Mystic Seaport. It was a board composed of museum directors and historians from around the country. I'm on their editorial board for their new historical journal that's just come out. So I've shifted from one thing to another.
What is a Mystic Seaport?
Mystic is a town in Connecticut on the Mystic River, and it was a little seaport. But ever since the 1930s, it's about as old as my museum is. It's a replicated New England fishing seafaring village with historic buildings, some of which have been brought from other places, and they have, just as we do, a collection of ships, small craft, and it's a living history park. And it's one of the great maritime museums in the United States.
You write for many publications, your own peer-reviewed journal for the museum. What is the name of that?
The journal is called Mainsail Haul. The name of the journal, Mainsail Haul, alludes to a command given when you're tacking a big square rig sailing ship. Sailing ships can't sail directly into the wind, so they have to do a series of slants across the wind, kind of like taking switchbacks up a steep hill. You know, if the hill's too steep, your car can't make it, so you do switchbacks. Well, that's what sailing ships do, and they tack back and forth, each tack gaining ground towards their destination if their destination is the direction the wind's coming from. So when you do this on a big ship, it's pretty complicated, and you have to time everything right. So of the 10 separate commands you have to give to tack a ship like the Star of India or the San Salvador, one of those where the yards are swung from one side around to the other, the command is given, it's called mainsail haul. You say mainsail haul and the crew knows to swing the yards around. And that is kind of an emblematic phrase, and that's why long ago that was chosen as the name of our journal.
You've also published papers in a journal called the American Neptune. Why do we still honor the Greek god?
I guess because Neptune is the god of the sea, right? And just like we continue Greek mythology and Greek culture, now kind of part of Western civilization, right? I guess that they picked up on that and said, well, instead of the Greek Neptune, this is the American Neptune.
And I suppose many other cultures have their gods or goddesses of the seas.
Yeah. Like the Polynesians, Tangaroa or Ta'aroa in Samoan. So, yeah, they do. Seafaring societies typically have close relationship with the supernatural because for seafarers, it's always kind of an unpredictable, dangerous environment to be in. So most seafaring cultures over time have had a lot of superstitions and a lot of religious beliefs wrapped around the sea and its supernatural presence.
And we still love the sea, and that's why one can enjoy going to your museum to learn more about it. And for people like me who get seasick, I don't when I go to the museum and look at the ships. So I urge everyone to find out more about our wonderful maritime history. How many maritime museums are there? And do they preserve and protect all the different kinds of ships that have been in the world?
Well, there's probably about 30 or 40 at least in the United States, maybe more than that. Around the world, several hundred, no doubt. Not all maritime museums actually have ships, however. Some of them just have models of ships, paintings of ships, portions of them, like pieces of them, like instruments and things like compasses and whatnot, or they have documents. So ships are pretty big and they're expensive to maintain. So you don't find that every maritime museum has that.
I want to thank you so very much for sharing what you are providing with us. Thank you for being my guest.
Well, thank you so much for being on your show. I really appreciate it.
I have been speaking with Dr. Raymond Ashley, President and CEO of the Maritime Museum of San Diego. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.